Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Toni Morrison, The Pieces I Am. Toni Morrison, The Pieces I Am is a 2019 documentary about the life and literary career of Toni Morrison. On a personal level, the documentary follows Morrison's life from her childhood in Lorain, Ohio, to her impactful career as a visionary editor working at a major publishing company in New York City. But tying it all together are the stories of the inspiration behind her legendary novels and the importance of her transformative writing style. Watching the documentary immediately reminded me of Maya Angelou in the sense that one of the very first interview clips with Morrison is where she explains being a young child and having her older sister teach her to read. They would go out on the street on the sidewalk and write words with chalk or a rock or something along those lines. They started out writing basic words, but then this one day, a little further down from their house, they saw another word, an unfamiliar word, and decided to copy it, writing out the letters of F, U, and on from there, only to have their mom come out when they were a good way through and immediately tell them to get stuff to erase it, to clean it up. It wasn't until she got to be quite a bit older that Morrison realized what exactly the word was and why her mom reacted so strongly. But as a young child, it embedded itself in her mind because of the power that it had over her mom, that this word, these letters, could elicit such a reaction from her, taught her in that moment the power of words. It reminded me of Maya Angelou and her book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, where she spent, I believe it was several years, but some period of time, refusing to speak due to a traumatic event and its aftermath in her own life, which taught her the power of words. Granted, the two experiences are quite different. One is a cute anecdote about Morrison as a kid, and the other one comes from a very traumatic childhood experience. In learning about the lives of people who go on to do great things, quite often there was an experience that happened. For some people, it was when they were children. For others, it might be later in life. But there's this moment in life where they awaken to the possibilities of what they could be. With these two particular women who would go on to be powerful writers and thinkers, the connection jumped out to me. This thing of them having these experiences in their childhood that would remain with them through the rest of their lives. They would look back years later and point to a specific moment or a specific experience that taught them the power of words, something that they would respect and use to express themselves in their ideas later on in life. It's basically how they would make their mark on the world. Every now and then I get into this thing where I'll start reading books on a particular subject or that share a theme. In 2015 or somewhere along those lines, I read one book about Black history and it just took me down a rabbit hole. And here we are with Noir Histoire. Then a few years later, I decided to read books about American presidents. As a kid, it was Greek mythology, the Goosebumps series, pirates. When I was in high school, I went to the school library around the time that I read and watched Beloved. This was several years after the movie and the book had been released. For whatever reason, I was drawn to Toni Morrison books. My school's library had a good amount of her books, or at least a copy of each of her titles on a shelf just filled with Toni Morrison books, and I just decided to start reading them. I think Beloved was the first Toni Morrison book that I ever read, and I remember thinking it was okay. I began to make my way through the other titles, but I was quite young and reading the books really just to read them, but not really reading them to understand. I didn't fully get them at the time. I was likely just looking for something to pass the time during my hour-long train commute and decided that I would knock these books out one after another. But I wasn't really taking the time to digest what I was reading or to analyze what I was reading. I didn't fully appreciate them and the thoughts and ideas that were being expressed in the book. And so with that, I didn't really get the genius of her books or the genius of her writing. The books didn't really hit me then as they should have. I don't remember them eliciting much of a response or much thought on my part because basically if I'm looking back on it now, I was kind of just going through the motions and not giving much thought or feeling to the book. This has been the experience that I've had, not so much with books, but more with some of the movies that I reviewed. Going back and looking at them, experiencing them through a different lens. It gives me a different perspective, a deeper perspective, where things that I overlooked before or didn't really notice before, I notice now. It could just be a matter of like maturity, more life experience. I don't remember if I read The Bluest Eye when I was in high school, as reading it last year, the story seemed largely unfamiliar to me, but it had a tremendous emotional impact on me. I felt for the characters. I cared about them. I thought about them, and I thought about the book while I was reading it. Reading parts of it and analyzing things mentally, even after I finished the book, it wasn't maybe transformative, probably isn't the word, but the book hit in a completely different way reading it at this time. I didn't have the same experience reading any of Toni Morrison's books when I was in high school, but this time around, I was immediately vested in the characters. I didn't cry or anything like that, but just felt very emotionally invested in these characters, especially the character Pecola Breedlove, as well as the two other little girls, the sisters. I had the response to that book that I think it truly deserves. I really don't know what the situation was when I was in high school, but at this point, after reading the book and feeling the way that I felt in reading it, I now have this plan to revisit Toni Morrison's book because I did them a disservice the first time around and not given them the attention they deserve. It wasn't until last year when I decided to read The Bluest Eye after writing a Black history profile about Toni Morrison the previous year that I really began to appreciate her as an author. I then came across this documentary and figured that it might be a good option to check out, and I was happy that I did. Overall, the documentary discusses the life of Toni Morrison, a biography of her life and her career, but also the writing process and inspiration for her different books. So it's an examination of her life, a biography of her life as a person, but then also her career as a writer and an editor. I remember in the epilogue of The Bluest Eye where she explained the inspiration for the book and how the story came about. This thing of her being a kid and having a friend during her childhood who expressed to her that she didn't believe that God was real because she'd been praying for years for blue eyes and her prayers hadn't been answered. And later, thinking back on that moment, it gave Morrison the inspiration for The Bluest Eye. It was a harrowing and heartbreaking experience to read about this young girl and the things she was going through in life in The Bluest Eye. But then to read the author's notes and realize that there was a real girl out there who felt this way. She might not have had exactly the same experiences as Pecola, but the fact that she saw herself in this way, that she saw her circumstances in this way, made it hit home even more, made it all the more real and heartbreaking. And the reality that given the time period in which Morrison wrote the book, this young girl that she knew at that time, and even in the years since, she wasn't the only person feeling this way, wishing and hoping for blue eyes, and that this little white identified characteristic might make her life better, might make her life easier, might make her life more livable, improve the quality of her life, solve some of her problems. The reality of just how difficult and heartbreaking it was to read that made me really consider the words and the implications and everything that was being said. It was an experience. Prior to that, I'd done a Black history profile of Morrison and learned a bit about her background. Reading words on the page are certainly fine, but hearing someone's words in their own voice is a completely different thing. So with that, the documentary gave additional depth and feeling to telling how The Bluest Eye came about. I found myself very engrossed in this documentary. Prior to discussing The Bluest Eye, they touch on Morrison's writing as a collective, where Morrison's books typically center on the Black experience. And it's important to make a distinction that her books are not just about Black people, but they speak to Black people. She points out that this is something that you see in books, movies, literature, where although the characters might be Black people, the stories might be about Black people, quite often the intended audience is white people. It's something that I think about as far as like, where does inclusion end and a problematic pattern begin? So she explains it's a way of explaining the Black experience. But as stated, if I'm a Black person talking to another Black person, I don't really have to explain Blackness to them. Quite often, unless we're from different parts of the diaspora, we generally don't have to explain Black culture. So I really dug that perspective, the explanation as to how and why that guided her writing style. And it was actually pretty revolutionary in the 1970s. It was different from what a lot of other people were doing. Even when you look at writing now, when you look at media now, be that in the form of books, movies, television, music, you still see this conflict where there's a lot of focus placed on appealing to white people because at least within America, they're the largest audience. And so from a marketing, financial, and economic perspective, it makes sense to appeal to them. But it also speaks to this thing of our society being white-centered and the various implications that has, where this one group of people, their views, opinions, tastes, and whatnot are deemed as being more important or more worthy of being appealed to versus this other group of people, as in white people versus black people. And so I thought the way she expressed it, where her intent in writing is not to write for white people. They're certainly welcome to read whatever she creates. Anyone can read her books, but she's not pandering. She's not going out of her way to appeal to white people. She's not speaking on behalf of black people or trying to explain the black experience to anyone. She's presenting moments from life, asking questions and things like that about black people, writing to basically have conversations with black people rather than speaking at them. And pretty much it's like a conversation between her and black people, but everyone else is welcome to listen in. I enjoyed the multiple layers to the documentary where you have the story of Morrison's biography as far as where she was raised, her experiences in childhood, her going off to college, and life as a young adult. All of these personal details of her transformation into adulthood, her transition into adulthood, raising children after having been married and then divorced. So you have this personal story. You get to know her as a person, as a human. But then as part of this, you also get to know about the Toni Morrison known by the public. So she actually mentioned at one point that her birth name is Chloe Anthony Wofford, but Toni comes from Anthony, and then Morrison was her married name. And so with that, this is how you get Toni Morrison. And to the public, she's known as Toni Morrison, but was born Chloe Wofford. The name Chloe is a bit more commonplace now in comparison to when she was growing up. And so she explains that people would just mispronounce her name all the time, just completely butcher her name, which led to her choosing this other name to go by, and that became her pen name. So you have this public versus private persona, which she points to as well. You get the story of Chloe Wofford, but then you also get this dual story of Toni Morrison, the author and editor. This person who has written at least 5 to 7 novels amongst a larger body of work that received a great deal of attention, if not critical acclaim, respect, and admiration from other writers and readers. You have Morrison, the writer, and the documentary takes the time to dive into some of her most popular novels to have her explain in her own words her inspiration, the driving force behind them, the moments from her life that gave her these creative ideas. So you get the backstory of the inspiration for, of course, the Bluest Eye, but also Sula, Song of Solomon, and Beloved. And what I found really interesting was that these books that would become these very highly regarded and well-respected books were inspired by what was sometimes just like a brief momentary experience, like with the Bluest Eye. Like with the Bluest Eye, this childhood friend mentioning in passing that she didn't believe in God because she'd been wishing for blue eyes for forever. They hadn't come, her life hadn't changed. And then there's later this thing about reading a short newspaper article about this enslaved woman who, rather than seeing her children return to bondage after having failed at an attempt to escape, killed 2 of her children. And that became the basis for Beloved. I just found it really interesting that these little brief moments or things that she came across would be the driving force for these very impactful novels. It was just very inspiring. And then beyond that, the detailing of her creative process, how she writes, the time of day at which she writes. Now, granted, things like this vary from person to person, but I just find these little tidbits about creative people and successful people as far as what their habits are. I find them to be incredibly interesting. Everyone has their own methodology, but I like getting these little insights. Not to say that I'll take them and apply them directly to my life, but I just find them interesting to learn about. I also like watching athletes train. It's the same kind of thing, right? People have their own little quirks and habits, and I just find it interesting to find out that these heralded individuals, these people that go on to become public figures, that they have these little quirky habits and superstitions like the rest of us. So there's this thing about her constantly and forever writing any and everywhere, right? Which is cool. Angela Davis actually mentions them driving in a car, and when they would stop at the light or for any reason, Morrison had a little scrap of paper and would write down ideas or little bits and pieces for her book. To think that this book would go on to become a whole novel, or I imagine writers with a very sumptuous office, wood paneling, sitting down, writing, real fancy environment. And you realize that wasn't the case here. It was on a scrap of paper, on the go, in the car, anywhere else. And as a busy single mom, she was basically fitting in writing wherever she could. Beyond that, I just found the insight into her writing process to be incredible. Sure, you get an explanation of the overall writing process as far as like the time of day, but I really like that they took the time to break down each one of these major novels, the inspiration, and then how she took it from idea to reality. Because we all have ideas, we all have hopes, we have aspirations, but there's a wide chasm between dreaming and doing. And so to see an explanation of how she penned not just one great novel, but multiple great novels is cool. I like the entire documentary, but the breakdown of her writing and her books was really great. Another topic that's touched on is her career as an editor, where she started out editing like regular books. Began at a smaller company that was then acquired by a larger company, and she was like swept up in that acquisition. She then became ensconced in this larger world of publishing. It sounds like she probably worked on some regular novels, so consider like your general mainstream books, but then actually used her position to start introducing a lot of Black authors and specific titles that would go on to be quite notable. I still haven't gotten around to reading Angela Davis's autobiography, though I have read books and seen movies about her. I knew her autobiography as being heralded, as being a masterpiece, but I didn't know that Toni Morrison played a substantial part in the book being written. Angela Davis says that Morrison was actually the one who encouraged her, or more accurately pitched her on the idea of writing a book about her life and experience. She stressed the importance of Davis putting things down in her words, as far as like everything that happened with the Black Panther and other situations like with the Soledad brothers and all that kind of stuff. And so zooming out a bit, Morrison actually started out as an editor and had a vision to spark a renaissance, a new 1960s to 70s-ish renaissance for Black writers at a time when the landscape for books by and about Black people was dramatically different from it is now. She kind of initiated this cultural shift of Black people writing not just about Black people, but for Black people. I thought it was really cool that she used her power as an editor to make this vision a reality. She used her position to then create opportunities for other people. I find that sometimes when Black people move into new spaces, there's this push for us to expand and move into places and take advantage of opportunities. But I feel that sometimes when we get into these new environments, because of the precariousness maybe of our own position, we sometimes operate from a place of scarcity. Some of us are then less inclined to reach back and help others, or adopt the belief that in order to achieve success or continued success, we then have to separate ourselves from our Blackness to some degree, and that means other Black people as well. That's just really not the case here. Or I think she proves that's really not the case, or it doesn't have to be. That good work with the right backing can be incredibly successful. And her stepping out on a limb, having the vision to see Black literature for not just what it was, but to look beyond to what it could be, and then to work to go out and seek out artists and help them write their books, to put together, I think it was an anthology, I can't remember the name of it, but it's like this book about Black history and culture. To have this vision and put all of that together is incredible. And at the same time, while doing all of this work for other people, helping to promote these books by other authors that would go on to be so notable, in the midst of this, while having a career as an editor, being a single mom, her life being full, she still found the time to write, and not just write anything, but to create these masterpieces was just mind-blowing. As I mentioned, I did a Black history profile about her, but I hadn't previously read like biographies or seen any other documentaries about Toni Morrison. But I think this documentary does a really incredible job of telling her story, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I highly recommend it. Certainly if you're a fan of Toni Morrison's writing, but I think even beyond that, if you're a writer or interested in like similar creative arts, it's definitely a great documentary for you to watch. Even if you're like an avid reader, though not necessarily specifically a fan of her work, just that you like reading in general, you might enjoy the documentary as well. It's just very well made. It's about Toni Morrison, sure, but I think there's a lot of insights here about writing, about the publishing industry as well. There's just a lot to be learned here, and it's definitely worth checking out. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes and sources are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. I'm working on creating downloadables and infographics, so keep an eye on the website. These Black History Facts are released every Wednesday, so if you enjoyed this episode and want more, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my Black History Facts playlist.